The conference room felt like it was closing in on me as Marla DeVrich slammed a stack of papers onto the mahogany table. The sound echoed through the silence, making water cups rattle and everyone's heads snap up from their laptops. "Ellie, this is completely unacceptable," she announced loudly, her voice carrying across the room with deliberate authority. "I can't keep defending your behavior to upper management." 20 pairs of eyes swung toward me instantly, some confused, others curious, all hungry for the drama unfolding before them. My stomach dropped as I realized this wasn't a normal performance review. This was a public execution. Then the bomb dropped with devastating precision. "You're being reassigned effective immediately. We need actual team players in leadership positions, not people who can't collaborate." My ears started ringing loudly. My throat tightened until breathing became difficult. My vision blurred around the edges as shock set in. Betrayal hit me like cold water splashed directly across my face, violent and immediate. I'd worked beside this woman for 5 years, trusted her guidance, believed her promises about my future. And now she was destroying me in front of everyone who mattered. I am Ellie Stanton, and in that terrible moment, I learned something profound about humiliation. Has a heartbeat, pulse, a rhythm that matches your own racing heart. And mine was pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. I stood up carefully, forcing my legs to support my weight even though they felt like they might collapse beneath me at any second. I couldn't let them see me break down completely. Not here. Not now. Not in front of Marla and her satisfied smile. I walked toward the conference room door with as much dignity as I could manage, keeping my head up and my face neutral. But the moment that heavy door closed behind me, isolating me in the empty hallway, everything changed. My legs almost buckled immediately. I grabbed the wall to steady myself, pressing my palm flat against the cool surface for support. My breathing came in short, ragged gasps that I struggled to control. What the hell just happened? The question kept repeating in my brain like a broken alarm system that wouldn't shut off. 5 minutes ago, I'd been a department leader with a respected position. Now I was publicly humiliated and demoted without warning or explanation. Nothing made sense. Marla had praised my work just last week during our one-on-one meeting. She'd talked about upcoming opportunities and advancement potential. She'd smiled warmly and encouraged me to keep doing exactly what I was doing. How had everything changed so dramatically and so quickly? I leaned against the wall, trying to process what had just happened while fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. The hallway stretched empty in both directions, offering no answers and no comfort. 5 years earlier, everything had looked so different and promising. Marla DeVrich had been the mentor who'd promised to help me grow professionally. She was already a director when I joined the company fresh from graduate school, ambitious and eager to prove myself. During my first week, she'd taken me to lunch at an expensive restaurant downtown. "I see real potential in you, Ellie," she'd said warmly, leaning forward with apparent genuine interest. "Work closely with me, and I'll make sure you advance quickly here." I'd believed every word completely. Those first few years, Marla praised my work loudly in public settings where others could hear. She'd announce my accomplishments during department meetings, making me feel valued and recognized. But the criticism came quietly in private, always behind closed doors where nobody else witnessed it. "You need to be more collaborative," she'd say with a concerned expression. "People think you're difficult to work with." I hadn't seen the pattern then. I didn't understand she was systematically undermining my confidence while appearing supportive publicly. She was prepping me to be useful to her career advancement, not successful in my own right. Every compliment came with subtle strings attached. Every opportunity had hidden costs I didn't recognize until much later. Looking back now, I could see how carefully she'd manipulated everything from the very beginning. At my new desk, which was significantly smaller and positioned in a much less desirable area of the office, I sat down heavily and opened my laptop with shaking hands. The demotion was real. The smaller workspace was real. The humiliation was devastatingly real. My inbox loaded slowly, and near the top sat a forwarded email chain I hadn't been copied on originally. Curiosity mixed with dread as I clicked it open. The email chain revealed everything with brutal clarity. My major projects had been reassigned to Calvin Winters, who I knew was Marla's cousin through family connections nobody was supposed to acknowledge officially. The transition plan had been discussed for weeks without my knowledge or input. Every detail had been arranged carefully behind my back. The timeline showed Marla had started planning this demotion at least 6 weeks ago, right around the time she'd been praising me most publicly. The realization hit like a physical blow to my chest. This had never been about teamwork or collaboration issues. This was about replacing me with someone she could control completely, someone who owed her everything and would never question her decisions. Calvin was family. Calvin would be loyal without requiring competence or independent thinking. I'd been set up to fail so Marla could install her preferred replacement without facing questions about nepotism. The plan was calculated, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. And I'd walked right into it without seeing any of the warning signs she'd carefully hidden. Later that afternoon, Marla walked past my downgraded cubicle with measured steps, clearly making the journey deliberately to check on me. She stopped at the entrance, blocking my exit path, and offered a smile that was all perfect white teeth and absolutely no warmth behind the eyes. "I hope you settle in quickly, Ellie," she said with false cheerfulness. "This change will be good for everyone involved." Her tone suggested concern, but her body language radiated satisfaction. I could feel her watching carefully for signs of a breakdown, searching for tears or anger or any emotional reaction she could use against me later. She wanted to see me broken and defeated. She wanted confirmation that her public humiliation had achieved its intended effect completely. I gave her absolutely nothing she could use. I looked up calmly, met her eyes directly without flinching, and smiled pleasantly. "Thank you for your concern, Marla. I'm adjusting just fine." My voice stayed steady and professional despite the rage building inside me. Her smile faltered slightly, just for a fraction of a second before she recovered. She'd expected tears or complaints, or maybe even a confrontation she could report to human resources. Instead, I'd given her polite acceptance that offered no ammunition whatsoever. "Well, good," she said, recovering her composure. "Let me know if you need anything." She walked away slowly, and I could feel her disappointment radiating like heat. That small victory felt surprisingly good despite everything else that had happened today. The moment my shift ended, I gathered my belongings quickly and headed straight to the restroom on the far side of the building where nobody from my department ever went. I locked myself in the furthest stall, the one with the broken lock that required holding the door closed manually. Only then did I finally let the tears fall. They came silently, streaming down my face without dramatic sobs or loud crying. These weren't the tears of someone seeking attention or sympathy. These were the kind that hurt deeply because they came from a place much deeper than wounded pride or professional setback. They came from betrayal. From realizing someone I'd trusted completely had been systematically destroying me for months while smiling to my face. From understanding that 5 years of loyalty and hard work meant absolutely nothing when faced with nepotism and calculated manipulation. I cried silently for maybe 10 minutes, letting the pain flow out until it diminished to something manageable. Then I wiped my face carefully, checked my reflection in the mirror to ensure no visible evidence remained, and walked out of that restroom with my head held high. The tears were finished. The mourning period was over. What came next would be different entirely. I wasn't going to cry anymore about what Marla had done to me. I was going to think strategically about what came next. And that required a completely different emotional state than grief or self-pity. The following week, I started actually paying attention to the work flowing through my new position instead of just processing it mechanically. As a demoted assistant, I now handled departmental workflow documentation that I'd never seen before in my previous leadership role. Every document, every expense report, every vendor contract, every approval request passed through my hands for processing and filing. What I discovered in those files made my pulse quicken with a mixture of shock and growing realization. There were discrepancies everywhere once you knew where to look. Budget requests that didn't line up with actual department needs. Vendor contracts with inflated costs that didn't match market rates. Overtime approvals for projects that had been completed weeks earlier than the submitted timesheets indicated. Equipment purchases that never appeared in our inventory systems. And every single inconsistency, without exception, led directly back to Marla's signature. She'd been manipulating departmental finances for at least 18 months based on the earliest documents I could find. The pattern was clear once I started looking at the data objectively instead of trusting her explanations blindly. Marla had created a system where she could redirect funds, approve questionable expenses, and benefit personally or through family connections without anyone noticing because nobody else saw the complete picture. But I saw it now. I saw everything. And suddenly, my demotion looked less like punishment and more like the biggest mistake Marla had ever made in her carefully constructed scheme. The irony was almost beautiful in its perfect symmetry. By demoting me to this assistant position, Marla had removed me from leadership visibility where my questions might raise concerns. She'd isolated me from decision-making authority where I could challenge her choices. She'd pushed me into what she assumed was a powerless position where I'd either quit in humiliation or accept my diminished role quietly. But what she'd actually done was give me unrestricted access to everything. In my previous leadership position, I'd only seen the projects and budgets directly relevant to my team. I'd trusted Marla to handle the broader departmental finances appropriately. I'd never had reason to question the overall budget allocations or examine vendor relationships closely. Now, as an assistant processing every single piece of departmental paperwork, I saw the complete financial picture. Every request, every approval, every transaction, every discrepancy. Marla had demoted me directly into the perfect vantage point to see her entire operation. She'd placed me exactly where I could observe everything she'd been hiding from leadership oversight. The position she'd meant as punishment had become my greatest strategic advantage. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but I kept my expression neutral as I continued reviewing files and documenting patterns. Marla thought she'd won by humiliating me publicly and removing my authority. She had absolutely no idea what she'd actually done. I started building my case with the same meticulous attention to detail I'd always applied to my work. Every evening after the office emptied, I stayed late organizing evidence that nobody else was looking for yet. I created detailed spreadsheets tracking every inflated cost I discovered. I documented vendor contracts that charged significantly above market rates, then noted which vendors had connections to Marla's extended family network. I compiled overtime approvals she'd signed for Calvin that coincided with weeks when our project management system showed he'd barely logged any hours at all. I organized suspicious expense reports chronologically, noting patterns of weekend charges and personal purchases disguised as business costs. Every piece of evidence was saved to my personal encrypted cloud storage with timestamps, source documentation, and contextual notes. I didn't just collect random documents. I built a comprehensive narrative that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. Each file was labeled clearly, color-coded by category, and cross-referenced with supporting documentation. Someone with no prior knowledge of our department could review my files and understand exactly what had been happening within 30 minutes. This wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. This was about justice. About protecting the company from someone who'd been stealing from it systematically. About ensuring that hard-working employees weren't being taken advantage of by someone who'd weaponized her authority. And yes, about making sure Marla faced consequences for what she'd done. Not just to me but to everyone. The shift in power dynamics started subtly during a cross-department budget review meeting. Marla was presenting quarterly projections to division leadership, speaking confidently about resource allocation and efficiency improvements. Then someone from finance asked a specific question about departmental spending patterns. Can you explain the variance between projected and actual costs in the facilities category? Marla's confident smile faltered slightly. She shuffled through her presentation notes, clearly searching for information she didn't have immediately available. I'd need to pull those specific numbers, she said, trying to maintain her authoritative tone. That's a very detailed operational question. I'd been sitting quietly in the back of the room, supposedly just there to take notes as her assistant. But I had those numbers. I'd seen them while processing vendor invoices just yesterday. Without thinking about the implications, I spoke up calmly. The variance is approximately 18%, I said clearly. Most of that comes from the facilities management contract renewal that came in higher than our original projection from last fiscal year. The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at me with varying expressions of surprise. Marla's face flushed slightly. "Thank you, Ellie," she said tightly, her voice carrying an edge of warning. "But I can handle the presentation." The finance director nodded slowly. "Those numbers align with what we're seeing in the consolidated reports. Good to have confirmation." Marla's smile looked strained now. The room had taken note. Someone else had better information than the director presenting. That night I couldn't sleep at all. My mind kept racing through possibilities and scenarios, planning next steps and anticipating consequences. I got out of bed at 2 in the morning and went to my home office, pulling up my encrypted files on my personal laptop. I spent hours organizing everything into a master file directory that told a complete story. Every document was categorized precisely. Financial irregularities in one folder. Nepotism evidence in another. Falsified approvals in a third section. Supporting documentation cross-referenced throughout. I created an executive summary that could be read in 5 minutes and understood completely by someone with no prior context. Then I wrote detailed explanations for each category of evidence, including dates, amounts, and specific policy violations. I added timeline visualizations showing when patterns had started and how they'd escalated over time. By sunrise, I had a case file that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. It was thorough, professional, and absolutely devastating. I saved everything to multiple backup locations, encrypted with different passwords I'd memorized rather than written down anywhere. This wasn't about dramatic confrontation or emotional outbursts. Revenge isn't loud or theatrical. Real revenge is meticulous, documented, and irrefutable. It's patient and strategic rather than impulsive and emotional. And I was building something that would stand up to any scrutiny because every single piece was verified and factual. Marla had made the mistake of underestimating me completely. She was about to learn exactly how costly that mistake would be. The unexpected ally appeared 3 days later during a routine budget clarification meeting. Cole Anders, a senior finance manager I'd only met briefly during department orientations, asked me to explain some discrepancies he'd noticed while reviewing consolidated reports. "I'm seeing some unusual patterns in your department's spending," he said, his tone professionally neutral. "Can you help me understand the vendor relationships and approval processes?" I could have deflected to Marla. That would have been the safe political move for someone in my demoted position. Instead, I provided calm, factual details without editorial commentary. The facilities management contract was renewed at a 23% increase, I explained, pulling up the relevant documentation. The vendor is Winter Solutions, which provided the lowest qualifying bid according to the RFP documentation. However, the previous vendor we'd used for 3 years submitted a bid that was actually 17% lower, but was rejected for not meeting minimum qualification standards that were added to the requirements after the initial RFP was published. Cole's eyes narrowed slightly, but not at me. He was looking at the numbers with the focused attention of someone who just spotted something wrong. "And who approved those revised requirements?" he asked carefully. "Marla DeVrich signed off on all RFP modifications," I replied, keeping my voice even and factual. The revised requirements specifically excluded our previous vendor based on regional service limitations that hadn't been mentioned in any prior contracts. Cole nodded slowly, making notes. "Thank you, Ellie. This is very helpful context." He didn't say anything else, but I could see his mind working through the implications. The seed had been planted. The break I'd been waiting for arrived completely by accident 2 weeks later. Marla sent an email to Calvin with detailed instructions about upcoming budget submissions. Except she didn't just send it to Calvin. She accidentally copied me on the message as well, probably because my name appeared right above his in her frequently used contacts. The email was devastatingly explicit in its instructions. Make sure you massage the numbers on the consulting line item before the audit review, she wrote. We need to show at least 15% reduction from last quarter to justify the efficiency gains I promised leadership. Move some of those costs into the training budget where they won't get as much scrutiny. And backdate the invoices to match last month's reporting period. My pulse spiked as I read the message 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. This wasn't just financial irregularity or poor judgment. This was explicit instruction to falsify financial records before an official audit. This was a smoking gun that proved intentional fraud rather than simple mistakes or oversight. I immediately forwarded the email to my private archive, creating multiple backup copies in different secure locations. Then I sat at my desk for several long minutes, forcing myself to breathe calmly and think strategically rather than react emotionally. Marla had just handed me exactly what I needed to prove intentional wrongdoing. The question now was timing. When and how should I use this evidence to maximum effect? I drafted a reply to her email, keeping my tone completely neutral and professional. Noted. I wrote simply, giving no indication that I recognized the implications of what she'd asked Calvin to do. Letting Marla think I was harmless became my primary strategy going forward. I responded to her emails promptly and professionally. I processed her requests efficiently without questions or commentary. I smiled politely when we passed in hallways. I gave her absolutely no reason to think I posed any threat whatsoever to her position or plans. The perfect camouflage for someone who was harmless was acting exactly like someone who'd been properly defeated and accepted their diminished role. Marla seemed to relax slightly as weeks passed without any confrontation or pushback from me. She started treating me like furniture, barely acknowledging my presence during meetings. She discussed sensitive matters openly while I sat nearby taking notes, as if I didn't exist or couldn't understand the implications of what I was hearing. Her arrogance made her careless in ways that benefited me tremendously. She stopped being careful about what paperwork came through my desk. She signed things hastily without considering who would see them later. She had conversations with Calvin within my earshot that revealed information I wasn't supposed to know. Every mistake she made, I documented carefully and added to my growing evidence file. I maintained my pleasant, neutral expression through all of it. I kept my reactions invisible and my thoughts private. Meanwhile, I continued organizing evidence, strengthening my case, and waiting patiently for exactly the right moment to act. Patience had become my greatest weapon. Marla's impatience and overconfidence would be her downfall. The contrast couldn't be more perfect. The boardroom dynamics shifted visibly during a quarterly planning meeting. Cole Anders had apparently been conducting his own quiet investigation based on the information I'd provided him weeks earlier. He scheduled a meeting with division leadership, and surprisingly, I received an invitation while Marla did not. The executives gathered around the conference table looked curious about my presence. Cole explained calmly that he needed me to walk through the department's workflow and budget processes. Ellie handles all the operational documentation, he explained. She can provide clarity on some questions that have come up during my review. For the next 90 minutes, I presented information calmly and professionally. I explained our vendor relationships, approval processes, and budget allocation procedures. I showed them workflow diagrams I'd created that illustrated how decisions moved through various approval stages. I answered their questions with factual, detailed responses that demonstrated complete knowledge of our operations. The executives took careful notes throughout my presentation. Several times, they asked follow-up questions that clearly indicated they were seeing problems I hadn't explicitly stated but had made visible through my data presentation. Why wasn't this process review presented earlier? One executive asked, looking around the table with obvious concern. This raises some significant questions about oversight and internal controls. My stomach flipped nervously, but I maintained my calm exterior. Something was definitely changing. The power dynamics I'd known for 5 years were shifting visibly right in front of me. Marla stormed into my cubicle less than an hour after the boardroom meeting concluded. Her face was flushed with barely controlled anger. "Are you trying to undermine me?" she demanded, her voice tight with fury. "What exactly did you tell them in there?" I looked up from my computer slowly, meeting her eyes with the same calm expression I'd been maintaining for weeks. My heart was racing, but I kept my voice steady and professional. "I walked them through our departmental workflows," I replied evenly. "Cole asked me to explain our operational processes, and I answered his questions truthfully. I'm just doing my job, Marla." Her face twitched visibly as she struggled to control her expression. "Your job is to support department leadership, not make us look bad to executives." "I haven't made anyone look bad," I said calmly. "I simply provided factual information about how we process budgets and vendor contracts. If that information raised concerns, perhaps we should discuss why our current processes might be problematic." She stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to determine if I was being deliberately provocative or genuinely naive. I kept my expression neutral and professional, giving her nothing definitive to read. "Just remember where your loyalties should be," she said finally, her voice carrying an unmistakable threat. "And remember who controls your performance reviews and future prospects here." Then she turned and walked away quickly, her shoulders tight with visible tension. I watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and nervousness. She knew she was losing control. The question was what she'd do about it. The audit announcement came through official company communications 2 days later. An external firm would be conducting a comprehensive financial review of all departments as part of routine annual compliance procedures. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more devastating for Marla. I watched her face drain of color when the email notification appeared on everyone's screens during a department meeting. Her usual confidence evaporated instantly. Her carefully applied lipstick couldn't fully hide how pale she'd gone beneath her makeup. She started pacing during breaks, her nervous energy impossible to conceal. She snapped at people for minor mistakes. She micromanaged Calvin until he was literally sweating through his dress shirt by mid-afternoon. Her behavior became increasingly erratic as the audit date approached. She held emergency meetings to review processes. She demanded documentation that should have been easily accessible but apparently wasn't properly maintained. She sent increasingly frantic emails about cleaning up files and organizing records. Meanwhile, I stayed silent and observant. I processed the audit preparation requests that came through my desk. I organized files exactly as requested. I maintained my calm, steady demeanor while Marla spiraled into visible panic around me. The contrast was stark and noticed by everyone in the department. People started watching both of us carefully, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Marla's desperation was becoming obvious. My composure was becoming equally apparent. The power dynamic had shifted so dramatically that even people who hadn't been paying attention before were starting to notice something fundamental had changed between us. The first major crack appeared when one of our largest vendors contacted the company with concerns about invoice discrepancies. Winter Solutions had apparently been submitting invoices that didn't match the contract terms they claimed to have agreed to with our department. The vendor relationship manager forwarded their complaint to our department, asking for clarification. Marla tried to handle it personally, but the vendor specifically requested to speak with me. "We were told that Ellie Stanton handles operational documentation," their representative explained during the conference call. "We need to speak with whoever actually processes our contracts and invoices, not management." I was pulled into a meeting with the vendor representative and our internal procurement team. They asked detailed questions about the contract terms, approval processes, and invoice submission procedures. I answered everything with neutral, factual language, referencing specific contract clauses and documented approval workflows. "According to our records," I explained calmly, The original contract specified a monthly flat rate for facilities management services. However, the invoices we've been receiving include variable charges for services that were supposed to be included in the base rate according to the original RFP specifications. The vendor representative looked confused. That's not what we were told during contract negotiations. We were informed that variable charges were standard and expected based on actual service delivery. Their confusion was genuine and telling. Someone had misrepresented the contract terms, either to the vendor or to our company. Probably both. The procurement team exchanged significant glances. Another crack had formed in Marla's carefully constructed facade. And this one came with external witnesses who had documentation of their own. Calvin appeared at my desk 3 days before the official audit was scheduled to begin. He looked terrible, with dark circles under his eyes and visible trembling in his hands. "Ellie, can we talk privately?" he asked quietly, glancing around nervously to make sure nobody was listening. We went to an empty conference room. Calvin collapsed into a chair and put his head in his hands. "I did what she told me," he said, his voice shaking. "With the numbers, the invoices, all of it. I didn't know it was illegal. She's my cousin. She said this was normal business practice, that everyone adjusted figures to meet targets. I trusted her completely." I sat across from him, keeping my expression neutral despite my racing pulse. This was the break I'd been waiting for. "What specifically did she ask you to do?" I asked calmly. Calvin looked up at me with desperate eyes. "Everything. Backdating invoices. Moving expenses between budget categories to hide overruns. Approving overtime for hours I didn't actually work. Creating vendor contracts with her family members' companies. All of it. She said it was fine, that she had authority to manage the budget however she needed to meet department goals." I let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking carefully. "Calvin, the auditors are going to ask you these same questions. Do you want to tell the truth now? Or later when they ask you under oath and lying becomes a criminal offense instead of just an employment issue?" His face went even paler. "What should I do?" I didn't comfort him or offer reassurance. "That's your decision. But the truth is going to come out regardless during the audit. The only question is whether you're part of the problem or part of the solution." The audit team requested all departmental correspondence and documentation 2 days later. Standard procedure required providing everything relevant to financial processes and approval workflows. I submitted my meticulously organized archive files to the audit team. Every document was properly labeled, categorized, and cross-referenced. The timeline visualizations showed patterns clearly. The executive summary explained everything concisely. The supporting documentation proved every claim conclusively. They didn't ask why I had everything so thoroughly organized. They didn't question why a demoted assistant had compiled such comprehensive records. They were too busy reading through the evidence and recognizing immediately what they were looking at. I could see their expressions change as they reviewed the files. Professional curiosity became focused attention. Focused attention became obvious concern. Obvious concern became the kind of serious looks that indicated they'd found something significant. One auditor asked me to walk through my documentation system and explain how I'd organized everything. I did so calmly and professionally, treating it like any other work request. "I process all departmental paperwork," I explained simply. Maintaining organized records seemed like the logical approach to ensure nothing got lost or overlooked. I created this filing system to make information easily accessible when needed. The auditor nodded slowly. "This is remarkably thorough. How long have you been maintaining records at this level of detail?" "Since I was reassigned to this position," I replied honestly. "About 4 months now. 4 months of comprehensive documentation. 4 months of evidence. 4 months of building an irrefutable case." The auditor made careful notes without further comment. The confrontation happened in the middle of the audit review meeting. Marla burst into the conference room where the audit team was working. Her professional composure completely abandoned. She pointed directly at me with a shaking finger. "This is her revenge," she announced loudly, her voice sharp with desperation. "She's sabotaging me because I had to demote her for performance issues. Everything she's telling you is twisted to make me look bad. She's manipulating information out of spite and personal vendetta." The room went completely silent. The lead auditor looked up from the documents spread across the table with an expression of calm professionalism that somehow felt more intimidating than anger would have been. "Ma'am, we're reviewing signatures and approvals," he said evenly. "These are your authorizations on financial documents. We're not relying on anyone's interpretation or testimony. We're examining records you personally signed and submitted." Marla's face collapsed visibly as the implication hit her. "But the context," she started desperately. "You don't understand the full context of those decisions." "Then perhaps you can explain," the auditor continued calmly, "why vendor contracts were modified after RFP approval to favor companies owned by your family members. Or why expense reports include personal charges disguised as business costs. Or why you instructed your assistant via email to falsify budget reports before our review." He slid a printed copy of her email to Calvin across the table. The email I'd forwarded to my archive. The smoking gun she'd accidentally sent me. Marla's face went from pale to completely ashen. Everything unraveled with devastating speed once the audit findings were presented to company leadership. By the end of that week, Marla was placed on immediate administrative leave pending the completion of the investigation and potential legal proceedings. Her access to company systems was revoked. Her company credit cards were cancelled. Her office was sealed with security tape while investigators catalogued everything inside for evidence. Calvin was reassigned to a different department under close supervision. His employment status dependent on his cooperation with the investigation. Other employees who'd been involved in questionable approvals were interviewed extensively. The department fell into a strange kind of shocked silence. People whispered in hallways and break rooms, trying to piece together what had happened. Most had known something felt wrong but hadn't been able to identify exactly what. Now the truth was spreading through official channels and unofficial gossip networks simultaneously. I watched quietly from my cubicle as security escorted Marla out of the building on her final day. She carried a small box with personal items, her head down, her confident stride completely gone. She didn't look in my direction as she passed. I didn't smile or show any visible reaction. Not yet. This wasn't the moment for satisfaction or celebration. This was simply justice following its necessary course. The process wasn't about my feelings or revenge. It was about protecting the company and ensuring someone who'd abused their authority faced appropriate consequences. 2 weeks after Marla's departure, I received an unexpected invitation to present a recovery plan to the executive leadership team. They wanted recommendations for rebuilding departmental processes and restoring financial controls. I prepared thoroughly for that presentation, knowing this was my opportunity to demonstrate everything I was truly capable of when given the chance. Walking into that boardroom felt surreal. These were the same executives who'd watched Marla demote me publicly just months earlier. Now they were asking for my expertise and leadership to fix the problems she'd created. My hands didn't shake this time as I set up my presentation materials. My voice was clear and confident as I began explaining my proposals. For the first time since that terrible conference room humiliation, they truly listened to what I had to say. I outlined a comprehensive plan for restructuring departmental workflows, implementing stronger financial controls, and creating transparency in vendor relationships. I proposed new approval processes that would prevent single points of failure. I suggested audit procedures that would catch irregularities early. I presented everything with the same meticulous attention to detail I'd applied to documenting Marla's fraud. The executives asked thoughtful questions. They took extensive notes. They nodded appreciatively at several points during my presentation. When I finished, the division president looked around the table at his colleagues. "This is exactly the kind of strategic thinking we need in department leadership," he said clearly. Several others voiced agreement. Something fundamental had shifted in how they saw me. The new nameplate was installed on the glass office door exactly 3 weeks after my boardroom presentation. It read, Ellie Stanton, Director of Operations, in clean, professional lettering. The same office where Marla had once told me I'd never move up beyond mid-level management. The same office where she'd planned my public demotion. The same office she'd occupied while systematically defrauding the company. Now it was mine. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the space that represented everything Marla had tried to deny me. The corner windows overlooking downtown. The substantial desk and credenza. The bookshelf for professional resources. The conference table for team meetings. But more than the physical space, it represented vindication. Validation that my work had always been good enough, that my skills had always been valuable, that the problem had never been my performance or ability. The problem had been Marla's corruption and insecurity. I'd been systematically held back by someone who saw me as a threat to their fraudulent operations. The demotion that had seemed like career destruction had actually been the catalyst for exposing everything. If Marla had left me in my leadership position, I might never have seen the complete financial picture. I might never have discovered the full extent of her fraud. I might never have built the comprehensive case that brought her down. She'd destroyed herself by trying to destroy me. The irony was absolutely perfect. I walked into my new office and sat down at the desk that was now mine. My desk, my office, my department to lead properly. Several weeks into my new role, a budget request came across my desk for approval. It was from Facilities Operations, the department that had absorbed some of Marla's former responsibilities after the organizational restructuring. The request was routine in most ways, asking for approval of vendor contracts and equipment purchases for the upcoming quarter. But one line item caught my attention immediately. It was a consultation fee request that seemed slightly inflated based on market rates I'd researched. The justification was vague. The supporting documentation was incomplete. It was exactly the kind of thing Marla would have approved without question, or possibly even encouraged. I read through the request calmly, making factual corrections to the problematic sections. I sent it back with clear notes about what additional documentation was needed and what cost adjustments were required to align with company standards and market rates. No accusations, no personal commentary, just professional feedback about compliance requirements. The revised version came back 2 days later with all my requested changes properly addressed. I reviewed it carefully one final time, confirmed everything was now appropriate, and approved it with my electronic signature. No gloating, no personal message, no contact with anyone involved beyond the standard approval process. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing I'd won because I stayed steady, smart, and completely unshakable through everything. I didn't destroy Marla. Her own arrogance and fraudulent behavior did that without any help from me. I simply documented the truth and made sure the right people saw it at the right time. And now I ran the department she'd said I wasn't good enough to lead. The place she'd tried to steal from. The position she'd abused for personal gain. It was mine now, and I would lead it with the integrity and professionalism she'd never possessed.